a reciprocal arrangement to stop that same logs and those banned sawn timber from entering their country, from Indonesia, except Malaysia. Malaysia has a log import ban from Indonesia, and that's the only country that has it. So how else do you stop illegal timber if you know it's illegal? And that is why we got all these regulations coming up. LACI, the FLACTI, the European Union FLACTI Action Plan, CITES, and others. I'll just give you a very brief overview on this. LACI, Chip has already mentioned, is around for 100 years more actually. So it's not new legislation. It is just that in 2008, they amended the legislation to include forests and forest products. So as long as those forest products enter the US will be able to take action if they have sufficient proof. Okay? So there are various things that is required for you to fulfill the regulation under LACI for the US timber import. Okay? So what it does is that US prohibits trafficking in illegality, in illegally harvested plants and plant products, including timber of course. You got various penalties depending on the type of violation, whether you know that you are actually doing it illegally or you do not know. Like I buy from another source, I do not know whether it's legal or illegal, but you are still liable. It's just penalties might be lower. And it requires a US importer to file a plant import declaration. Now I mentioned that LACI has been around for 100 years. What it means is that the US enforcement agencies actually have experience of LACI already. They've got 100 years of experience. Now they're just expanding in the timber. That's all. So they know what to do. They are just expanding in the timber. And you can get more information from the APHIS website on the US Department of Agriculture. As I said, the PowerPoint will be on the web, I think, so you can access all this. Now, FLACTI. Yes, I remember. Oops, what's happening? Like magic. And I didn't touch anything. FLACTI, I'm just going to go very briefly because Vale is going to speak about it a lot more on FLACTI. What I want you to be aware of is that for the European Union, the FLACTI Action Plan, the Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Action Plan, has been around since 2003. They got 4 main areas of focus. The first is the Voluntary Partnership Agreement. That means agreement between the EU and the country that is interested to sign an agreement with the EU to come up with legal timber for export to the EU. It's a very specific agreement and it's a voluntary basis, so it's bilateral. Not all countries have done that, so there are some. Wale will expand on that. Public procurement policies. We have seen in an earlier slide. We know that Denmark, UK, Germany, and various other countries, Netherlands and so on, have their procurement policies. Due diligence regulation, the timber regulation, they have adopted it. It's going to be enforced by March 2013, and that's a special regulation where companies have to do due diligence before they can export to the EU. And of course, they got technical and financial assistance. I won't go through the VPA, you can read it at leisure, or Vale will expand on it a bit more. And there is CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It has been around since 1976. It lists species under Appendix 1, 2, and 3, depending on the degree of protection it requires. Appendix 1, no trade. Appendix 2, you can trade with a license, with a permit. Appendix 3, the same. It's a way of monitoring and to carry out enforcement if required. So, a bit similar to the BPA in a sense. I won't go into the details with you. Now, I'll move on to my second presentation, which follows on from here. Yes. Thank you. Am I going too fast? Now, I already mentioned new laws. new challenges or not? After all, like Lacey, the law has been around for 100 years. It's just expanded to timber. But what does it mean when you have legislation, new legislations? What does it mean to the business, the companies? What does it mean to the governance of the forest and the trade? I already mentioned some of the legal instruments. I'll just add on a few more. Those ones that I've mentioned in my earlier slides are already there. They are being enforced. Right? The Lacey EU timber regulation has not been enforced, but it's been enacted since 2010. The voluntary partnership agreement, once it's signed, then they are looking at implementation. There is also Swiss law. But the Swiss law is quite simple. It just wants a declaration, like species, country of origin, and so on. So you just need to fill that, and you're fine with the Swiss law. Then there's the Australian law on illegal logging prohibition. I think we have got colleagues from Australia, but correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of this bill from Australia is that it is a hybrid between Lacey in a way and the EU timber regulation. So it's a mixture of both. Hopefully they'll pick the best of both. So we are hoping Australia will lead the way. So what does all this mean? For all these legal legislations that you have to follow, how would enforcement agencies know you're legal? Or your buyers from the consumer countries, your producers selling? How do you know? Am I buying legal or not? If you say 35% of illegal logging is still happening in Indonesia, how do I know you're not one of the 35%? So what I'll just give you as an example of this. Look at it as a timber legality assurance system, a whole system as well, a generic one. I'm just looking at generic. Okay? So we got a simple trade flow. It's a lot more than that. Okay? It's quite complicated in reality. But in general, we are talking about the forest, we are talking about the processing, we are talking about the export and the import. And that links it all up, transport. Obviously, you have to move it from one source to another. So transport is a key actually. So what does it look like generically? You have the laws in relation to the forest resource itself. So you have to comply with that. In general, the BPA tries to tell you what the law means in those countries with regards to the management of the resource. Then you have to have your chain of custody to link it from the forest to your mill or to other points of trade that you want to. In general, to make sure everything works well, you will have to have some sort of legality verification and compliance. You have to verify the documents, and you have to verify a chain of custody. Now, in general, from all the laws that I've looked at, the forest laws more or less cover all this. They're pretty comprehensive. Why is that so? Because in general, from a government perspective, a producer country perspective, they want to make sure the resource is still there. They don't want to lose the resource. Of course, there's conflicts in terms of balancing act as to how much of the resource the forest should be allocated for infrastructure development and so on, and what remains as forest, so they can continue to get the revenue. So what government wants to is to get the revenue from the forest. So that's why they have the laws to manage the resource sustainably if possible, but legally. And what they want is the revenue generation, the fees, the royalties they can get for development purposes. So that's why usually the laws are pretty comprehensive to make sure that the forest that remains as forest is adequately managed and protected. And then they want to check at the mill, because that is one point where you can bring in illegal timber into the mill, and so you have to check. So governments do that. The question is how well do they do that? And whether you know whether they're doing their job or not. The laws are there. So this is basic. And then at the same time, if it goes for export, from all this, after processing, it goes through the export, through customs. And then it goes through import, where you have to go to customs again. So if you have a legality assurance system, then customs can review it and say, everything is done correctly, I can release that shipment for export. So during export, all shipments, doesn't have to be timber, anything, cars, tires, fruits, whatever, has to go through customs of your country. And you have to fill in the customs export declaration form of your country. When it arrives at the destination country, you have to fill in the customs import declaration form. Obligatory, compulsory. At both sides, you submit business documents, shipping documents, and so on to support. And yet, we always see that there are problems, as I mentioned. Indonesia has a log export ban, some timber export ban. How come we're still seeing all those all over the place? So what is happening there? So, traffic, we have done a lot of studies on this. We are proposing, if the customs during import, just check the customs export declaration form, you will know what has been exported. What species, what volume, what value. But that doesn't happen. So that's one premise recommendation we would like to push, so that you can keep it in mind, bring it back home, spread the message around. At the same time, for all of this, there is a move towards independent auditors to verify legality, because as I said, how do I know this is right documents, it's been falsified, and so on. So that is why you have independent auditors where possible. And this is where certification tries to cover all this, through independent auditors, to have the confidence that they have met through all the systems. For parts of this, the VPA looks at it. The VPA will come up with a timber legality assurance system, a license in general, for customs to check. The EU timber regulation doesn't do it that way. This is another way of looking at it, because the story is not finished yet. Same flow, a bit more pictorial, from the forest, mill, processing, transport, and export. And now you have additional layers. You have the reporting chain, because government is checking. That's what they do, right? So they have to get reports. They verify the reports. They double check it. Where possible, the rangers and so on are going to forests, they will check at the point of export or import, or whichever points that is mandated by law. There is an enforcement chain. If you do not comply with the law, they either fine you, seize your product, take you to court, put you in the jail. I did mention royalties and fees, right? Royalties and fees are just two aspects of it, of the financial aspect. There is more than that, because there's a business angle. A lot of finances flow around the entire supply chain. That is where a lot of things can happen in some countries. Now, as far as my understanding goes, in terms of the VPA, and to a large extent, the timber regulation of the EU, they cover the physical, the documentation, and the royalties. To my understanding, only LACI has expanded it to include financial, in all aspects, financial. But of course, it's much more difficult to prove, right? Because you need treasury, you need a central bank, and everyone else to be involved to get that. So there's a lot more things going on now. So it depends on the systems that's out there, what level you're looking at. And what Traffic has done actually, together with WWF, Global Forest Trade Network, simplified flowchart, as I said, transport, that's the main link, all the way to the point of export and import. How do you know whether you're legal or not? What we are trying to do is to give you guidance on this. What we developed is some verifiers. When you talk about harvest at the forest level, what is legal? Most forest departments will ask you for your license. You have to get a license. They ask you to prepare management plans, so you can take into account species, environment, conservation aspects, soil erosion, steepness, and so on. Your roads in the forest cannot be too wide. You cannot harvest certain species below a certain size, and so on. It's all covered in the management plans. And then you have the harvesting plans, which tells you specifically which tree you can harvest. In some countries, where you can fell it, the direction of felling, and so on as well. And then you have to have a removal pass, because you have cut the logs. You have to get a permit just to get the logs out of the forest. If not, you're not allowed to. So there's all this documentation that the government issues for legality and for them to comply. And then when it comes to transport, they have removable pass or transfer pass. Now all these terminologies varies depending on countries, but in general that's what it means. It's a pass to bring your logs out of the forest. Processing, you need a license, you need records. And then for all of that, you need your fees. So you get a receipt, then you pay your fees. If you don't get a receipt, that means you are illegal. At the same time, if you are forest, if you look backwards behind that, what about the land use plan? Is that a legitimate forest, permanent forest, that's been designated by law for you to be able to harvest it, or at least to get the rights to the harvest? The allocation of logging and the permit concessions, was it done legally? Was there bribery involved? How do you know? What does the law say? We try to capture all of that in the framework they have done. Environmental and conservation laws, domestic sales. So what we have done, we have tried to capture it all and group them up as according to principles. We have got 10. Well, actually it's 9. 9 principles which captures all these, all the way from the forest, processing, transport, environmental, social and conservation, taxes, import-export. Africa was unique. Africans felt that they needed to spotlight the situation with regards to subcontractors and partners, because there's less control there. Even though by law it might be there, but they felt that they need to highlight it much more because there were problems with subcontractors and partners. So what we've done is group it all together for ease of use with the verifier, so you know when you talk about access, what the law says for access, what documents you need, what permission, what agencies you need it from, and so on. How do you go about doing it? We have captured all those for this. Now bear in mind, in some of my slides I did mention about records, documents and so on. The officials issue permits, certificates and various legal documents. Chain of custody means you are able to track it, okay, traceably. That particular product all the way up through your supply chain. Now by law in general, as far as I can tell, no law in the world does that. Because the government does not need that. Because it needs a lot of manpower to monitor everything. So they only do it to a certain extent, from the forest, the permanent forest, to the mill, because they want to track that for royalty purposes, for resource management, sustainably manage the resource. So it depends. So what happens now? Certification and others, what do? They also do an underlying layer. Wale will bring that up about company's documentation, your own company's business procedures and so on, which helps when you combine it together, you have a chain of custody. So the way the company operates, how well they document internal procedures and systems is just as important as the legal approach if you're talking about chain of custody. So we cannot separate the two out together. So just bear that in mind. Legal only up to a certain extent, not all the way. So this is what it looks like. We've got the full principles, 10 principles with criteria. Some of the principles have got 2, some have 3, some have 5 criteria depending. And we got various indicators which are country specific because it depends on the laws of the country. Now, what we did it for 7 countries: China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, Central African Republic. We look at the laws in all those 7 countries, we trawl to them, we distill them out, we find out what is happening, then we harmonize it at the international level into those 10 principles. And then the criteria is the best that we could get from all the 7 countries. It's a benchmark. You can call it a benchmark. Some countries do not have legislation for certain criteria. You can take it a flip side that there could be a gap in that country, or maybe not. It's just the way they operate. But we have the best that we could find based on all these principles and criteria. Certain countries, as I mentioned, does not have some criteria because they don't have the legislation in place for those. Right? So the indicators are specific to the country. And we got verified. We went through stakeholder consultations. We asked lawyers to check all this to make sure it's properly documented from the legal perspective. We asked auditors to check it to make it as practical as possible. And we are getting more countries. We are doing much more countries actually to add on to the list. And all this is to help all stakeholders to know what it means to be legal. For VPA countries, FLEGT countries, for LACI, whatever that is required out there. We try to capture as much as possible to help stakeholders to understand what it means to be legal. I think that's, yes. And the full principles criteria is on our website. In the next few days we'll put it all up and we'll keep on adding to it, and that's the website that you can get it from. All right, thank you. I think I'm going to take it.
Thank you very much, Chen. Yeah, that's a great overview, and this basically this framework is really a good distillation of what kind of the state of the art to a certain extent. We hear from a lot of governments. Like in China, they're very concerned about this. They